مشاهدينا مرحبا بكم في حوارات السياق. تدخل الأزمة السودانية يومها 26 في ظل الجهود التي ترمي إلى إنهاء الصراع والوصول إلى وقف دائم لإطلاق النار. عموما للمزيد من المتابعة حول هذا الملف ينضم إلينا مات برايدن المؤسس المشارك والمستشار الاستراتيجي لمؤسسة ساهان للبحوث. أستاذ مات مرحبا بك معنا.
My pleasure, thank you.
هل مفاوضات ما قبل التفاوض متعثرة لأنه لا أنباء حتى الآن؟
Yes, indeed. I think the key there is the term you use, pre-negotiations, because it really seems that we're nowhere near any kind of substantive discussion about a resolution of the Sudanese conflict. We are trying to get to a form of communication about even a minimum humanitarian ceasefire, and perhaps then potentially we could talk about disengagement of forces. But at this point, it's just about the terms under which a ceasefire might be possible. And here we know the two sides are very far apart, that the Sudanese armed forces, or the SAF, are demanding that all forces, they and the rapid support forces, or the RSF, should return to the positions that they held prior to the outbreak of hostilities, and that the RSF wants a ceasefire that freezes forces in place, because the RSF moved very quickly in the early days of the conflict into Khartoum towards capturing the presidential palace and coming close to the military headquarters. And so a ceasefire that freezes forces in place would favor the RSF. SAF, of course, would like the RSF to withdraw back to its bases. So even there, I think the talks are stalled. They are still talking, but we see no signs of progress yet out of Jeddah.
أنت تخبرني أننا أمام هدف محدود لهذه المفاوضات، وهو هدنة والعمل على الجانب الإنساني، ومع ذلك لا تقدم حتى الآن.
That seems to be the situation. There have been suggestions that there could be, we could even reduce the objectives of the negotiations further to strictly humanitarian ceasefire, to allow provision of medical supplies, food, and so on, and also to allow essential services to resume, especially in the capital Khartoum, because for several days now, close to a week, water supplies have been largely cut off. Medical supplies have been effectively embargoed by a closure of the main pharmaceutical facility. And so civilians are really struggling to survive, not just sheltering in place to avoid being killed in crossfire, but actually just to have the basics and water in Khartoum, which is a pretty hot place, never mind essential medical supplies. These are things that, of course, people need. If even a humanitarian ceasefire is not possible, or corridors cannot be opened, then we're likely to see a very rapid deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Khartoum and possibly other parts of Sudan where there is fighting, and a rapid escalation as well of the number of people fleeing the country, which is now estimated at more than 100,000.
هل حان وقت الضغط على الجنرالين؟ هل ستستخدم السعودية وواشنطن أوراق ضغطها على طرفي النزاع لإنجاح المفاوضات؟
Absolutely, it's time to make some pressure. And many would argue that that pressure should have come much, much sooner, before this conflict started. I don't think anyone foresaw the timing of the conflict. It erupted so quickly, it took most observers by surprise. But the challenges of the political challenges were clear in advance of the conflict. Sudan was on the path to yet another round of negotiations for return to constitutional rule and civilian leadership. And the talks through December into January had been very difficult, and they were stuck. In particular, there was one issue that was incredibly vexed, and that was that the armed forces should all be integrated and that the RSF should become part of the Sudanese armed forces, which essentially meant that its leader, the General Hemeti, would become subordinate to General Abdel Fattah Burhan, a commander of the Sudanese armed forces. And so one side was going to surrender to the other politically. And that talking point was, it could not be resolved. And I think the warning signs were there that this could lead to armed conflict. It just happened faster than anyone expected. Now, since the US, Saudi Arabia, other countries didn't use sufficient leverage to get an agreement prior to the conflict, now is certainly the time to try. Saudi Arabia is perceived as being essentially neutral between the two parties. The United States as well, not particularly liked by either party, but not seen as favoring either one. So together, they have both the credentials and the leverage to potentially deliver some kind of preliminary result in pre-negotiations. But they can't do it alone. And so it's also important that we have, at the talks, we have what's called the Quad, the Saudi Arabia, the US, the UK, United Arab Emirates as well. And then there's a parallel mechanism, which is the trilateral mechanism, United Nations, African Union, and the Regional Organization for the Horn of Africa, IGAD, also trying to put pressure on the parties to de-escalate.
ذكرت أن السعودية والولايات المتحدة تقفان على الحياد في هذا النزاع، لكن هل هما فعلا كذلك؟ وماذا عن بقية الأطراف الإقليمية؟ من يدعم ماذا هنا؟
Well, that's a really good question. And we have to look at it at two levels. There is the messaging coming out of foreign capitals, and then there are the relationships, which are not always entirely transparent or well understood. In the public perception of the conflict in Sudan is essentially that the key actors, the closest partners to either side, are Egypt to the Sudanese armed forces, and many would say the United Arab Emirates to Hemeti, together with Eritrea. Saudi Arabia is certainly messaging a more pro-SAF position, but in terms of financial relationships, both sides have got business interests and financial interests tied up with Saudi Arabia, which gives them the ability to engage with both, even if their public messaging is leaning towards one side. The United States is in a difficult position because the US has been calling for return to civilian rule. Now, Congress in particular has been very critical of Burhan and of the military, and of course of Hemeti as well, partly because of his past as a leader of the Janjaweed militia. But the United States also has threatened sanctions on both sides, which could be an even-handed approach. There's been some suggestion that the United States is sequentially favoring Burhan. There are some analysts who are arguing from the US that sanctions should first be applied to the RSF and Hemeti because they are a non-statutory force. That is to say that the armed forces of Sudan are the legitimate army of Sudan, and that the RSF is an ad hoc force that was created to pacify the Janjaweed after the campaign in Darfur and to balance the power of the SAF while President al-Bashir was in power. The US would then have to threaten sanctions or apply them on the SAF to make sure that that they actually do lead a return to civilian rule.
هناك من سيجادلك حول هذه النقطة ويخبرك أن الجيش هو من قصف المدنيين والمستشفيات في هذا النزاع. لماذا لا يعاقب كذلك؟
Well, it's true. The army is the only force that has air assets. But in the early days of the conflict, the difference between these two forces is that the army is more heavily equipped. It has armor, it has artillery, it has air force, and therefore it has the destructive capacity in a sense that the RSF doesn't. What the RSF has, which is an advantage in some respects, is that it is light and mobile and fast. And so in the early days of the conflict, the RSF moved very quickly into Khartoum, so into areas populated by civilians, towards the center of Khartoum. And so RSF leaders and fighters have actually been quite open and public about this, stating that they can't afford to fight the SAF in rural areas where the SAF can bring armor and artillery and air assets to bear. They need to get into urban combat where tanks have little purpose. Aircraft, of course, ideally shouldn't be used because of the damage to civilian population. And they've said, we want the SAF to be courageous enough to face us inside Khartoum, face to face. So in a sense, the RSF has deliberately drawn the SAF into urban combat, and the SAF is using its superior means with terrible destructive consequences.
مريم المهدي وزيرة الخارجية السابقة وجهت اتهامات إلى نظام البشير بتأجيج الصراع. هل نحن أمام نوع من العودة لنظام البشير ووفق أي منهج؟
I do, absolutely. I think in this case, again, we have a propaganda war, and we have the realities on the ground. In the propaganda war, it's very clear-cut, black and white. The military has made an alliance with the National Congress Party, the Islamist party of al-Bashir, and is co-opting them in order to dominate the RSF. The RSF, the propaganda is that they have the support of the civilians because General Hemeti has called for a return to civilian rule. The civilians trust him more than the military. And so we have this dichotomy. In reality, it's a lot more complicated. Parts of the Forces for Freedom and Change, the civilians, are in fact in favor of Burhan because they had just reached an agreement, or most of an agreement, on return to civilian rule that included integrating the RSF into the SAF. So you have some civilian forces that favor that, the implementation of that agreement, and therefore the superiority of the SAF. In terms of the National Congress Party, or Bashir's Islamist lobby, there's a kind of devil's bargain here. They have money. Many of the officers in the SAF earned their stripes, had their careers under the NCP, and are sympathetic to the Islamist cause. But there are also many who are professional officers who have now assumed positions of leadership, and they despise the Bashir regime and everything that the NCP stands for. If the SAF and the NCP really do enter into an alliance, I would say there's even a risk of the Sudanese armed forces splitting between those officers who can work with the NCP and those who refuse to do so. On the other hand, we might also see fragmentation of the RSF. So this moment, as you said earlier, where we have both sides at the table and pushing for some kind of agreement, we need that leverage, is critical. Because if this moment passes, there's a danger that the Sudanese conflict will not be between two parties. It'll be between 4 and 6 and 8, and Sudan will be well on its way to becoming a failed state.
هل العالم مستعد لأزمة لجوء جديدة وما يتضمنه ذلك من توفير للمساعدات؟ طبعا جدير بالذكر هنا أن أغلب دول جوار السودان فقيرة.
No, I don't think we're talking about a country of roughly 45 million people, the third largest country in Africa. And the fighting is not just confined to Khartoum. It's also very heavy in Darfur. There's been fighting also to the north of Khartoum. And now we see the influx of fighters, mainly on the RSF side, from Darfur and also from Ad-Damazin in Blue Nile State. So the conflict risks bringing in more parts of the country. And of course, that means more refugees. The estimate, I think the United Nations has projected, is that we could see over 800,000 refugees. Now, where will they go? Chad has problems of its own, has a large refugee population, and cannot absorb many more. Ethiopia has also serious internal problems. The main crossing point at Metema is open for refugees. More than almost 2,000 have crossed. But Metema is in Amhara region, which is in itself unstable, facing serious problems. So that leaves Egypt. A lot of refugees have moved to the Egyptian border and are crossing over, seeking asylum there. And then, of course, there is the exit through Port Sudan, principally to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. But frankly, Port Sudan cannot serve as the humanitarian corridor for a crisis of this scope. So, plus, as you say, donor countries have been focused on Ukraine. I have heard from some Western donors that Sudan is a moment for the West to show that it's not only worried about conflicts in the West, that it is prepared to really up its game and invest in trying to resolve the crisis in Sudan. But the question is how. Most embassies have left, their staff have left, and the regional architecture, the organization IGAD, for example, which normally would be the prime peace and security instrument, is broken because Sudan is the chair. The executive secretary is from Ethiopia, which is itself beginning to recover from crisis. But IGAD itself doesn't have the political leverage to try to organize a response to Sudan either, let alone a humanitarian response. So I think you're right. The world's not ready for this. And if Sudan becomes a failed state, the risk of neighboring countries being drawn in different ways and it becoming a regional crisis, that's very real.
أستاذ مات، شكرا جزيلا لك للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.